Okay, so in the interest of time, I'd like to go ahead and get started. It's 3:02 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Hello, everyone. My name is Marisa Brazil. I am the Associate Director of Outreach and Community Engagement for ASU Research Computing, Arizona State University. I'm also the RMACC Women in HPC Chair, Chapter Chair. So RMACC is the Rocky Mountain Advanced Computing Consortium. And Women in HPC, WHPC, is a very large international organization. I'm going to post these links into the chat box, particularly for those who are new to the community, just so that you can learn a little bit more about us. But we are a community of research and computing data professionals. Without further ado, thank you so much for everyone, to everyone for attending. Our goal and our mission in general is to increase awareness and just diversity, equity, and inclusion in general for our community. And I would like to go ahead and start this with thanking a wonderful group of people who coordinated this panel. Rebecca Belche from ASU Research Computing, Lisa Klaus with Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Maria Van Hega, and I hope I said that correctly, Maria, with University of Michigan, Kristen Merritt with Alcys Flight Limited, and I know Kristen is in the UK, so the time zone might have been a little difficult for her to attend, but she did help us advertise and coordinate the event, and Jason Yalim also with Arizona State University. And thank you so much for coordinating this wonderful event. We are recording, so we will be able to share this event a little bit later with our broader community. I know Zoom can be very challenging. We're all in back-to-back meetings, and so just thank you for the opportunity to share this with our broader community. And without further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our moderator, Becca Belche from Arizona State University. Becca, take it away.
Thank you, Marisa, for that kind introduction. Hello, my name is Becca, and I'll be your moderator today. So before I begin, I would just like to give a huge thank you and welcome to our wonderful team of panelists who are so kind enough to join us today. Thank you for your time, as well as your willingness to share your experience about this really, really important topic. So to give a brief overview of the purpose of this discussion, this is an expansion on a previous discussion we had last month, where Vinay was kind enough to share his and his colleagues' experience in discovering and challenging bias within the tiny image machine learning data set. So with that, today we are hoping to expand on the discussion to bring awareness of bias within AI, but as well as to allow time for an engaging discussion where we can have actionable takeaways, where we can learn what can we do for best practices as support and development in AI, especially within high performance computing practices. So the very first 25 minutes, we're going to have a guided discussion with our panelists. We will then open the floor to our audience within the remaining part of the hour for any questions, comments, discussion that you might have. What I'll be doing first is I'll be going through our panelists one by one, and I will be giving each 30 seconds to a minute to introduce themselves. And we'll go ahead and we'll start off with Vinay. Oh, you're muted, Vinay, if you want to.
Yeah. Do I just give a brief introduction? Okay, sure. So my name is Vinay. I did my doctoral work at the intersection of statistical physics and network sciences at Carnegie Mellon, at the shared between School of Computer Science and Electrical and Computer Engineering departments. After that, I worked for about a year on what I kind of regret. I worked in the domain of fraud detection in healthcare. It was a pretty dark phase, I must admit. And now I'm currently working at UnifyID, where the emphasis is to basically try and model human kinematics using motion sensors with the viewpoint of basically disease state modeling, and to help democratize the motion sensors on your smartphones as instruments of medical measurements. Besides that, for the past year or so, I've been working on certain topics pertaining to what is putatively deemed to be AI and ethics. And most of my work is should be considered to be cliff notes from the belly of the beast, so as to speak. I speak as a practitioner who is certainly, I guess I increasingly see myself as being probably part of the problem. So it's just a matter of like internalizing the dark truths that's kind of unraveling in our domain, and hoping to see if there is any way in which a course correction can be brought about. And I'm extremely honored to be part of this esteemed panel here.
Thank you, Vinay, and just really interesting that you're sharing those points. And thank you also for being here. So for our next panelist, let's go over to Alice.
Thanks, Rebecca. Hi, everyone. My name is Alice Xiang, and I'm a senior research scientist at SonyAI, and I lead our research on AI ethics and responsible AI. And I also previously was the head of fairness, transparency, and accountability research over at the Partnership on AI, which is a multi-stakeholder organization that Sony is a member of. And my background is as an interdisciplinary researcher. So I have training both in law, statistics, and economics and machine learning. So kind of all over the map. And I previously also worked both as a machine learning developer and as a lawyer giving legal counsel to tech companies. And so in my research nowadays, I really focus on algorithmic fairness, explainability, causal inference, and questions of algorithmic governance. So I'm really excited for today's panel, since I think this really covers a lot of really important topics for us as a field, and also that's really manifested in the day-to-day of practitioners as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Allison. We're so excited to have you as well. Next up, let's go ahead and let Matissa introduce themselves.
Hi, my name is Matissa Hollister. I am a professor of organizational behavior at McGill University in Montreal, Canada. My background, my Ph.D. is in sociology, social policy, and quantitative sociology, so statistical sociology. And I have been spending the last year working with the World Economic Forum in San Francisco, leading a project on creating a practical toolkit for the responsible use of AI in HR. So I teach classes in people analytics, applying analytics in the HR sector, the big controversial one being, of course, hiring. And we're trying to help the everyday HR practitioner be able to understand the risks of and identify better and worse problematic tools in this area.
Thank you. And thank you so much for sharing that and for being here with us today. Next up we have is Daniel.
Thank you, Becca. Hi, everyone. Daniel Lim here. I'm also a fellow from the World Economic Forum, but my host organization is actually Salesforce. At the World Economic Forum, I lead the project on responsible use of technology, where we're trying to share best practices on how organizations can improve their ethical practices from inside organizations, whether it's from product development, how they're organized as a company, as well as some of the education processes that they can put in place to improve ethics. And my background, I actually have a very checkered past. I'm a trained physicist, also from Carnegie Mellon University, like Vinay. And but I went to graduate school in public policy. From there, I worked in the White House in the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the Clinton administration. And then most of the rest of my career in consulting, working at McKinsey & Company, as well as owning a design firm that later got acquired by Salesforce. I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you for hosting this. This is a very important topic.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you so much for being here. Next up, we have Jeanne.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jeanne Holm. I'm the deputy mayor at the city of Los Angeles, but a data scientist and technologist by training. We're doing a lot of work around using data, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and a variety of things in the public sector, and obviously around COVID, and trying to do everything from predictive analytics to understanding how to express racial equity within city services and the way in which we do our work and identify people and how we're supporting them. My background is not so dissimilar to Daniel's. I've been in federal government for 40 years before I came to the city. I spent 32 years at NASA as the chief knowledge architect, doing a lot of technology and social media work. And then 6 years with the Obama administration in the White House, helping to architect and build up and evangelize open data with data.gov. And then several years working with the World Bank in Russia, India, and mostly throughout Central Africa, opening up government data and fighting government corruption. And then I've been here at the city for a few years, which is my hometown. So I'm very happy to be here.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here. We're happy to have you. And since I know that you have to leave within 30 minutes and you'll be passing off the torch to Dawn. Dawn, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, thanks, Becca. Hi, everyone. Dawn Comer, also with the City of Los Angeles. I am the Broadband and Digital Inclusion Coordinator at the city, looking at how we can increase access, connectivity, and digital literacy for all Angelenos. I'm also the project manager for one of our machine learning and data projects, Predicting What We Breathe, where we're looking at satellite and ground sensor data to predict air quality. So it's a very exciting project as well. I've been with the city for a few years, but prior to that, I spent 20 years in management consulting, working across various industries, doing operations strategy. And right before leaving the private sector, I worked in digital transformation. So I served clients in the media and entertainment space, high-tech industry, as well as consumer products, and used a lot of social data and analytics to help in the consumer products industry so that retailers can start to understand customers better. So a lot of, I think, AI was starting to be entered into that space at the time. So I'm happy to be here today to share.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here. And that sounds very interesting. Looking forward to hearing more about it in the future. So with that, thank you all again so much for joining us and being able to share with us your experiences. And with that, we're going to go ahead and go to our first prepared question that we have. And I'm going to go one by one through the panelists. Again, I know some of them have already touched upon this, but just to emphasize for this conversation. Starting off with you, Vinay, how are data and artificial intelligence utilized in your professional setting?
Yeah, sure. So as I mentioned, I work with spatiotemporal data, which is emanating from motion sensors on commercial devices. So I basically kind of amalgamate techniques from what is known to be federated learning, which is basically machine learning with privacy guarantees, so that there is no data that is leaving your device, in raw form. And you basically kind of craft your algorithms so that there's just one directional inference, in the sense that you cannot reverse engineer anything about the person or the raw data on which the inference is being done. So with regards to that, I kind of use, I have to kind of harness tools from time series analysis, statistical physics, spatiotemporal modeling, and of course, deep learning.
Awesome. And you, Matissa?
Yeah, so really, I think it's a little bit of a wild west out there, how AI is being used in the human resources area. I think there's a million tools. They're all very different. Even two tools that both claim to help sort through resumes make different assumptions, take different approaches. That's part of what's confusing about it. But yeah, I would say there are people out there developing AI for everything from screening resumes to helping managers be better managers, provide customized career advice, training advice, predict who's going to leave the company. So it's there's lots of opportunities, some of them worrisome, some of them really exciting.
Absolutely. And you, Alice?
Thanks. So SonyAI is basically Sony's AI research arm. And so kind of think of it as a really early stage sort of deep mind kind of entity. And so really our bread and butter is AI research, and we're trying to work at the cutting edge there. In terms of our AI ethics work, where I sit, it also crosses over into the AI products in the company writ large. So Sony is a very large conglomeration of different types of businesses. And a couple of years ago, Sony released its AI ethics guidelines, and now we're working to put into place really robust AI ethics assessment processes. So this obviously involves a lot of questions in terms of how do you actually operationalize these sorts of guidelines. And there are a lot of business units within Sony that especially are areas where we're looking to implement this. So for example, image sensing technologies implicates a lot of AI ethics concerns, entertainment, finance, so on and so forth. So it's a really important question for a lot of the work that we're doing.
Agreed. And you, Daniel?
Yeah, thank you. At Salesforce, we have an overarching brand for all our AI capabilities. We call it Einstein. And for some of you who may not know, Salesforce is a consumer relationship management platform, whether it's helping sales folks track their opportunities or marketing professionals automate their marketing, as well as call centers manage the customer inbound requests. And each and one of those products has an Einstein and AI embedded in it. For example, in the Sales Cloud product, it has lead scoring. So it rates the opportunities that are at hand for a potential salesperson and ranks them as which ones has the greater likelihood of turning into a deal. Just as an example. And in the marketing product, it recommends content marketing messages for marketers to embed inside their email marketing campaigns using AI. And I also work very closely with the Office of Ethical and Humane Use. And similar to Alice, Salesforce has our AI and ethical principles as well, in which we apply those in various settings in how we assess our products, conduct risk assessments, as well as policies around how to use our products as well. So it's basically infused into almost everything that we do.
Sounds like it. And then how about you, Jeanne?
Sure. I'll just mention one thing, which is around the ability to kind of understand how we are making data accessible and doing that equitably and ethically. So we have an open data site that lets lots of folks get to the data at the City of Los Angeles. And we go out and meet with lots of community groups because it turns out that we have more data than we make accessible. So people are always asking for other data that may be of interest to them. And we've also just kind of reorganized that whole site to be able to put it in context with stories. So we talk about environmental justice and access to green spaces and trees. And so not just the data or even a map, but kind of the story and context around it and the evolution of work around that. The same is true with use of force and policing data and information about our digital divide that Dawn's been leading. And the other thing is we're just about to release a set of documents we've put out for some global review and that involves our code of ethics for how we develop content, software, and data, and how we make sure that we avoid implicit and inferred and even unintentional bias in that. And then also a set of a digital bill of rights for what people can expect and kind of their rights as folks in Los Angeles, California, and the country, and what they should know about privacy and those sorts of concerns. So we're trying to think of it sort of holistically as both the evolution of how we provide data, how we interact with people to understand that give and take of what they need, and then also to make sure that we are trying our best to remove bias from the collection of data and the interpretation of data, but doing that all as transparently as possible so that we can just be really open with it and people can call us to task if we are somehow still introducing bias.
That's really interesting and just incredibly important, and just being transparent, and kudos to you for doing that and supporting it. And for the next question, this is going to be to any of our panelists. You're welcome to unmute yourselves and answer it. But can you provide examples of how data or AI have approached or crossed some known or poorly appreciated ethical boundary?
Sure, I can go first.
Yeah.
I think I touched upon these in my talk as well. The thing, or rather the mother lode of all of these examples falls under what I believe is the conquest of these seemingly intangible social parameters by the computational ideology. Lest we forget that all of these sticky terms that people kind of milk careers out of, like deep learning, AI, narrow AI, AGI, are basically an ideology. It's not so much of a science as such. And a manifestation of this has been the computational conquest. So things like, can I infer gender of a person from just a face? Can I basically regress the trustworthiness? And basically we live in the age of the rebirth of physiognomy, basically, by using computational fancy tools. So the state of the art in computer vision is rather notorious, in my opinion, for being like hosting all of these ideas. If you look at the latest of the CVPR proceedings, you have like a whole cache of examples. So things like estimating saliency from an image. So if any of you are on social media, and if you uploaded an image onto Twitter uses AI or machine learning to basically find the salient parts of the image and crop it. Now that seems like a very sci-fi-esque venture, but at its heart is basically a pseudoscience. So two categories of examples that I can think of is, one is the computational conquest of the social metrics, like, or things like trustworthiness, or can I predict crime from a person's face, that kind of examples, and rebirth of physiognomy. The second, of course, has to do with surveillance, and I think a lot of people are turning face recognition into it's a little bit of a red herring, because beyond face, you have so many far more powerful tools of face-free passive surveillance that you can unleash onto the masses. So we are on the cusp of some rather, pretty, not very nice applications being, ushered in. This happens with a strong nexus with the toxic Silicon Valley culture at large. And but I'd like to be very honest and also throw in Salesforce as an example. Recently, there was this paper that was published that you can use reinforcement learning to hunt out the optimal taxation policy within your Einstein framework. I hope that it was done for some kind of PR purpose, or you're doing it with a grain of salt. But if you're talking about something like a taxation policy, and if you genuinely believe that reinforcement learning or deep learning is your panacea, that is a scary sign of things. I'm being brutally honest. These are like three examples that I'd like to share with the community here.
And definitely interesting examples of that. Are there any other panelists that would like to share their opinion as well?
I'll share. Part of the work that I've done with the city of LA is around smart cities. So as we look at developing smart city technology, there's definitely, as Jeanne mentioned, a concern and want to make sure that residents know how data is collected, make sure vendors understand how data is being used, and the city understands how vendors are going to use their data. So I think there's definitely concern and the need for ethical policies so that everyone's on a level playing field and understanding what's being used. But if you think about some of the predictive technologies or use cases that happen in our private lives, like when we're in loyalty programs, we want the store to know what our shopping preferences are. Some of those things are starting to cross over into city environments as well, whereas maybe there's predictive analytics around when a parking space will be available. Once the world opens up again, those are some of the solutions that we're working on. So those are areas where, as Vinay mentioned, surveillance may be a part of that, or we have to make sure that surveillance doesn't become a part of that as someone's looking for a parking space, or as more automation is being put into traffic signals and other solutions when it comes to scanning for those who may be doing illegal dumping or just scanning license plates. How do we make sure that we're being ethical and some of the solutions. So I think a lot of the work as we look to the future and the possibilities of technology in the government realm, what does that mean, and how are we careful to, how do we make sure that we're careful?
Absolutely, completely agree. Before I open the floor for our audience, I would like to touch up on one more question targeted towards our panelists. And that is, what is potentially risked or who may be marginalized by current automation implementation practices? So again, any panelist is welcome to unmute themselves and answer that.
Sure. If I can go first.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, it is rather clear that all of the, the historicity of oppression is certainly going to be replicated. So, of course, you have, people of color being disproportionately impacted. But I would also like to kind of throw some light on what I call as the plumage paradox. And it goes something like this. So the normative populace in the context of United States, let us assume that it is what is putatively deemed to be white. All right. So so that becomes the norm, and anything that is not norm becomes out of distribution. So you train models, and if you look at the issue with face surveillance, one of the earlier flavor of critique was that it does not work very well with dark-skinned people, right? But then this implies that you have the plumage paradox where reverse image search becomes that much more efficient with white faces. And that is something that we really need to have a conversation right now, because there are a lot of them who kind of believe in this, this quip that, you have to burn this technology to the ground, except I'm going to use the same tech when I deem it to be useful for me. And we have seen this unravel in front of our eyes in two different contexts across two different spatiotemporal situations. One in Belarus, where the pro-democracy protesters were taking pictures of cops, and because of the fact that reverse image search works rather well with Caucasian faces, they were extremely successful. And same is true with in the context of United States, we saw the same thing unraveling with the insurrection and also like the doxing of the far right, where people take pictures without consent, and then they use reverse image search engines to figure out who this person is in real life. Now, and you need to be aware of the fact that the technology that you're using to do right in your framework, lest we forget that that is exactly the same surveillance technology that you're using that will be used against you. So we have to kind of, we are at a point of reckoning where we either burn down the tech or make peace with the fact that I'm going to use it when I deem it to be fit, and which implies that victimhood is a guaranteed consequence of this.
Very good point. And just because I know that you have to leave here relatively soon, Gina, would you like to give any input on this question in particular?
Sure. So I think the issue of equity is so important, whether we're talking, and I guess there's a couple different ways to answer it. One is around the idea of who equitably can get access to the data, or who equitably can get access at all online, right? So the whole issue of the digital divide and digital inclusion and digital literacy is really at play in a lot of these as we start to talk about, more sophisticated technologies and the outcomes and the outputs of those, and how we make them accessible and understandable to folks. Another aspect too, I think, is how we then level the playing field a little bit. So we're doing a pilot right now with our seniors. We're providing a lot of free Wi-Fi or free broadband in public housing and through a variety of other programs that Dawn's been managing. But part of what we're trying to do is help our senior citizens be able to start engaging more, especially with telehealth and things around COVID that are being affected and exacerbated by COVID. And so not just sort of giving them access to these services and equity to these services through computer access, but also through voice activated, agent technology. And so as we start to think about using AI for that kind of technology, we need to think about multilingual access, people who might have speech effects, being able to do things that access city services. We were one of the first cities, or if not the first city, to put on Amazon Alexa and other services, many of our services, so people could just interact vocally to be able to understand that. So I think the issue of equity, we always think about equitable distribution of AI and like the description that was given earlier about photos and skin tones is so important, but also just equitable access. Thanks for letting me answer.
You're welcome. Thank you for the wonderful answer. Before I open the floor to our audience, would any other panelists like to share their input on this question in particular or anything else that we touched on?
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I totally agree with what Jeanne mentioned, and that it really starts with basic access. There's so much that works that needs to be done to give everyone at least a basic level of digital education and access so that they're benefiting from this massive digital transformation we're going through. And then to Vinay's point, there are some technologies that have great risks and some potential benefits as well. Facial recognition, it's a lightning rod. There are positive uses for facial recognition. For example, there's a company called Nautilus Analytics that's helping families and law enforcement officials find kids who've been kidnapped and using facial recognitions to search for them online. And that's obviously a more positive use of that technology, but there are obviously negative consequences as well, right? To be used for mass surveillance, and that's also why Salesforce has banned the use of facial recognition on our platform. And we are at that point trying to be clear about what uses are ethical and which ones are not, and some of it is the technology itself. But on top of that, it's how it's being used per the examples that I gave.
Absolutely, and that's just such a great point. I know part of that research also in regards to recognizing faces is also in recognizing places and locations such as hotel rooms and tracking that down. And what about you, Matissa? Did you have something you wish to add?
Yeah, it's a slightly different topic, but I think one other thing that can get overlooked and I think is a bit of a trap, it fits a little bit into the kind of overhyping of the computation of things is I worry a little bit about the sort of prioritization of optimization that happens in machine learning over kind of learning about the processes. So particularly in the, again, my knowledge is particularly in the HR setting, but we forget that optimization is optimization within the constraints of assuming that nothing is going to change in the status quo. Machine learning won't tell us how we can change a process and improve it. It says assuming that the sort of basic parameters of the world hold constant, here's the way to kind of get the best possible within those parameters. So particularly within hiring, we look at who performs well in the company, and you say, okay, we should hire more people who perform well in the company. Well, if the company is a hostile work environment, if the company doesn't have good policies for maternity leave, things like that, what you'll end up is with the tool that tells you that the kinds of people who do well in your company are certain kinds of people, and you should keep on hiring those people. And so taking into mind that sometimes some good old-fashioned just analysis of thinking and human creativity about thinking how to improve things can be better than the move towards just we'll run the data and we'll optimize, and forgetting that's actually a quite status quo approach. And that can end up, because if we think of all the historical problems that are entrenched in the status quo, then we end up actually entrenching it more rather than targeting it for improvements.
Absolutely, that's just such a great point to bring up, and thank you for sharing that. So what I like to do now is I would like to open the floor to our audience.
Rebecca, before we go on, do you mind if I weigh in as well? So yeah, I wanted to weigh in especially on the facial recognition point, because I think it's really hard within AI ethics to ever detach the context in which a technology is being used from the actual technology itself. Because at the end of the day, when we're talking especially about, say, bias mitigation or detection, there's often a lot of conflicting values at play. So for example, when we're talking about needing more diverse data sets in order to train facial recognition algorithms, in order to capture the diversity of faces in the world, on the one hand, there's a bit of a tension between representation and surveillance in that context, as Vinay pointed out, depending on how that sort of technology is used. And so certain use cases, for example, us, opening our phones, or, if we're using a camera, having it put the box around our faces, those are probably here to stay. But, we really need to be thinking very critically in higher stakes domains, especially, for example, in the criminal justice domain, Ukraine, where an incorrect face match could lead to someone being improperly detained, which has a lot of downstream impacts on their livelihoods. It's really important, I think, to consider that context in addition to the technology itself, because oftentimes when we're talking about bias detection and mitigation, we need to balance these challenging desiderata that might be in conflict with each other. And just to provide some more layers on top of this, for example, when we are talking about building more diverse data sets, this was something that IBM tried with their diversity in faces data set in a desire to build one that would be a lot better than a lot of the existing data sets that had focused just on images from celebrities or mugshots or other very questionable sources. But of course, that data set also came under fire because it was based on Flickr images, which folks had not properly consented to their images being used in facial recognition training. So I think that is an interesting example there where the desiderata of privacy is perhaps in tension with the desire for fairness. So, in an ideal world in terms of representativeness, maybe we would have faces of everyone to train our data on, but then there's huge concerns about privacy and surveillance associated with that. So how do we balance those things given that we can't just optimize in one direction? And I think that's what makes AI ethics so difficult, and also why it's so important that we're having these sorts of discussions with a wide variety of stakeholders and across disciplines as well.
Absolutely. And thank you for sharing. And I would like to encourage any audience members, if you wish to unmute yourselves and pose any questions to our panelists, feel free at this time.
I'll ask a quick question, and it's completely naive and probably uneducated because I don't know a lot about this space, but is there a forum or a place where you as practitioners are coming together and helping to create these best practices and inform these decisions upwards? So like, where is that filtering to? Is it, going to, are there federal agencies that you're speaking to and helping to inform as a community, or I guess I just don't, these conversations are great to happen here, but how do we level them up?
Yeah, so I actually, I'll jump in there. Part of the reason why I'm at the World Economic Forum is that it's a multi-stakeholder organization that brings in all aspects of our society at the highest level. So leaders in civil society, government, private sector, to work on issues that are aimed to create greater benefit for the world. And the Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution has centers in India, Japan, and here in the Bay Area in San Francisco, focuses on that from a technology governance standpoint. And Matissa and I are actually on the ML, machine learning and AI platform, where we're working on these issues. And one of the projects that one of our colleagues worked on was a playbook for AI procurement. So organizations that are buying technologies that is AI, our teams have created a great checklist of tools that allows them to think through some of these issues that they may have to consider to procure it in a more ethical way and can generate great benefit. And that came about through the multi-stakeholder dialogue that is part of this organization. And there's great benefit in that because, to Alice's point, ethics is really different for all parts of the world, right? Even looking at COVID, different countries are dealing with the question of privacy and how they're managing contact tracing differently because of the cultural sensitivities they have in their region. And this is true for ML and many other technologies as well. So bringing as many stakeholders to the table, creating the diversity of opinion and thought is really at the heart of how ethics and issues really get resolved, because then we can think about it from many angles, not just from an individual standpoint.
And I'll also give a plug for my former employer, the Partnership on AI, which is a multi-stakeholder organization that sits at the intersection of industry, civil society organizations, including many advocacy organizations that often are at odds in the public sphere with tech company policies, and also with academia. So it's a really unique organization in terms of being at the center of those three different parts of the industry and trying to do their best in terms of both research and convenings to have these sorts of conversations. And I'll also say that I think right now, given that so much of the AI ethics space is still kind of wide open, there's still a huge role for research within this. So I think a lot of the important conversations are also happening at conferences and workshops that are more focused on the ethical sides of AI issues. And so that's where I also see a lot of the cutting edge discussions happening.
Really great points. Does anyone else have any comments or questions that they would like to share?
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Sorry, I'm outside. I was wondering, so AI can sound kind of scary to people if you know you think too much about it, and it's wonderful. But I'm wondering, is there a way to encourage more people to look beyond the scary part and into the exciting part? And then on top of that, sort of how can we bring biases into the conversation and how you all are doing amazing things to work around it?
I have one answer on that, which is I think now that there's a lot of attention towards the scary part of AI, right? I think the beginning of the AI backlash has started. It was interesting. I was just talking with some HR professionals in the ministries of Canada government, and one of them said, I think people would be a lot less worried about this if you just called it HR predictive analytics rather than AI, right? So we had this period where I think especially a lot of companies that are selling these tools were sort of banking on the magical AI, right? The kind of all-powerful magical AI. And I think many companies are still doing that. They don't provide a lot of details about what they're doing, and they just sort of say like, this is this all-powerful tool. And I think now, given how much concern and how much people realize that there's bias, that these problems and stuff, that actually being much more straightforward about the limitations of AI and being more straightforward about what this tool is actually doing, and even what this tool can't do and what your own judgment is still needed for, is actually going to be a way that people will be much more comfortable using the tools and actually using them in a much more responsible manner. It was something that really struck me working with the people who are part of my project, who really pushed on the transparency part, and the transparency part being very clear, like, this is why the tool made this decision. This was the factors that went into this, so that you actually have confidence and understand what it's doing, but also maybe what it can't do. And I think that's also super important.
Yeah, and just kind of building off of Matissa's points, I think that AI is both a really great opportunity potentially for correcting some of the past processes that we've had that have been more human-based, and also is a danger in terms of perpetuating those. And it really depends what angle we take. If we really acknowledge that the default is for AI to perpetuate existing systems rather than to revolutionize them, then that hopefully gives us more of an inclination to use AI as a way to leverage the fact that it is more of a centralized process, a more quantitative process. So if we really install more audits and more scrutiny on the level of these mass AI systems, then potentially we could move towards systems that have more accountability compared to large decentralized human-based decision-making systems. It really just depends how we approach this. I think the problem thus far has been there's been such a default approach of automation bias, where people think, oh, wow, it's AI, it's trained on millions of data points, it must be so much better than any existing human system. What could I offer as a human in terms of overriding an AI system? I think we're moving away from that now, and that's good, because if we really combine the domain expertise and experience of humans along with AI systems and build in more checks and balances, then that can potentially yield a more powerful system overall in terms of actually addressing ethical concerns instead of just hiding them under the rug.
Yeah, one more thing I want to add to that is that being very specific about when AI is being used and how it's being used and being transparent about that. And then knowing that the limitations around it and then when it should be handed off to a human. And being clear about all those intersection points is critical. And I think generally speaking, when you use a term like AI in a general setting, it raises the hope and the fears at the same time. I think if you become more and more specific to, well, this is how it's being used and this is how we're managing it, you begin to understand and more educated around the implications around that use case. I think we need to get to that point, and we're early in this progression and learning all the various uses and being specific about them.
I'd like to just add like one historical point to this. We have had like this flavor of conversation before. There was a schism between what we now study as cybernetics that emanated from the halls of excellence of the Soviet academia. And a lot of beautiful books have been written about the early history of AI and the emergence of who it is that coined AI. And if AI is indeed the answer, then what is the question? So the community's had this debate, and there is a very interesting chronotope that develops about this handoff that happened between cybernetics to AI. And then came the era of the expert systems and stuff like that. So these marketing tricks will remain. I guess it's there's this Silicon Valley quip that goes something like, once you decide to eat shit, don't nibble. And that is kind of what's unraveling at a larger scale, in my opinion. With regards to the second part of your question that you raised, you brought about this very interesting points about ushering people in. And that is part of this process that we call as democratization. And I think you raise a very interesting point as to the fact that the community is not paid enough heed towards understanding the circumstances in which a person enters the field. And that is where I think the MOOCs and these self-help groups or DIY groups or forums like fast.ai and stuff like that have an extremely important role to play. Because if we are going to be carelessly democratizing this or using democratization as a red herring shtick to basically carelessly, like for example, I can think of 10 different examples, especially with face recognition or like gender and age classification and problems like that, where the idea of like democratization has not really worked out well. So I think, should also take inspiration from other technologies and how they have promulgated and their experiences, specifically things like nuclear technology and wireless communications, and basically seek and kind of learn from their experiences.
Agreed. Before I open the floor for a new question, Dawn, did you want to share a point?
I was just reading the chat that was happening and agreeing with the comments. My 20-year management consulting time was with IBM. So there's a lot of AI happening, a lot of machine learning. I was there right during the time of Watson coming online. And so it's just, we always talked about people, process, and technology. And whether it's a system implementation, whether it's, for HR, for finance, for supply chain, for whatever the case may be, a lot of times the people part, the change management piece, the org piece, the behavior piece gets left behind. And it's just as important here with AI. And that's what's coming to mind in the conversation that I'm hearing, that we can't forget, even in this space, we can't forget behavior. We can't forget change management. We can't forget the people part.
I completely agree. My background is actually in behavioral statistics with a focus on psychology. And I completely agree with that. Too much within statistical studies, you focus on the whole, but you forget the individuals, you forget the people. And that's just something we cannot allow ourselves to forget, especially as people who represent the underrepresented, right? So awesome. So does anyone else have an additional question they wish to ask or a comment they wish to share?
Yeah, Rebecca, I think you brought in an extremely important point of the question of the individual, right? Allow me to give you a very specific example that I'm currently researching, and that is the frailty behind this technology called saliency cropping. Like I said, that's heavily used in by companies like Google News, Adobe, Apple, and a lot of the tech companies. So the idea is that you have an image, and there is this audacious claim that using convolutional neural networks, you will be able to guesstimate what are the salient parts of the image. And so that you can kind of automatically crop it, or you can kind of enhance the aestheticity of the image, and all of those very hand-wavy, rather far-fetched claims. So in this, the pipeline is such that you have a lot of volunteers coming in, and they basically have like this fancy gadgetry that kind of tracks their eyeball movement and the microsaccades. And then you have the saliency points that emerge for each image. So depending on what is being shown to that person, each volunteer will have completely different parts of the image which is interesting or salient for that person. But when you train your machine learning algorithms, you typically train them on just snapshots of average saliency, where the experience of, or the cultural values of a person, using which that person focuses on one part of the image and not on the other, is completely erased out. So you typically use Mattern like smoothing kernels to kind of end up with an average saliency map for an image, and that is used to train machine learning models. And this is a very, a vivid case, an example where the individuality is forgotten, which is why if you go on Twitter, you have so many people complain about the fact that, this crop of this image looks very weird because it seems to enhance the male gaze. Or, there was this famous example of this image grid where you have a black person, empty space, and a white person, and the black person's image was always getting cropped. So, this is a prime example of a case where the individual's agency is lost because you want to kind of create, like a very simple pipeline for you to be able to train your machine learning algorithms on, completely decoupled from human experience, where it's just, a rat race towards getting the lowest Shannonian cross entropy error. And the whole thing kind of gets, buried within the larger vices of algorithmic bias reduction and so on and so forth. So that is an extremely important point that you raised, that the agency of the one is increasingly lost when you train and you automate your machine learning training pipeline.
Absolutely, that's just such a great point. And with it being close to 5 minutes to the hour, I do want to share that if anyone wishes to stay past the hour, including our panelists or audience, and wish to have further discussion, you're more than welcome to. But at 4 o'clock, if anyone needs to leave, Marisa will be sending out the recording. But before we do close this conversation, I would like to address the panelists one more question, and that's, what advice would you give us as research computing and data practitioners, leaders in higher education institutions to mitigate bias in AI?
Well, I already put my quick thing in, so I'll say it quickly, which is involve social scientists, as well as the people who are being impacted, right? But I think it's the social scientists, sociologists, organizational science people, economists are spending a lot of their time studying bias, right? So they're going to have an idea of which variables are going to incorporate bias. There are features in the ML terms. They're going to have an idea about how things might impact, and also the opportunities where you could actually create tools that will make the world a better place rather than just encode the status quo.
Absolutely. And Dawn, I saw you unmute yourself. You want to share your point?
Sure. I'll just add to think of diverse inputs. So I think there's a wide range of thinking of diversity. It's beyond race and color, but also experience. So think of, expand the aperture on what it means for diversity and for inclusion to also include lived experience, because that also will determine how the algorithms are built.
Agreed. And how about, go ahead, Alice.
Thanks. So yeah, +1 both to interdisciplinarity and diversity. And I'll just layer on top of that, that I think also it's important for folks to realize that we're really operating in a gray area right now in terms of algorithmic fairness. And it's always going to require some degree of nuance and contextualization. So there's never going to be just a, oh, here's like one bias metric, and if you just optimize for that, you can get rid of the bias and then your system is just totally fair, good to go. It's a lot of really complicated questions, many of which that are in conflict with each other. And so you really have to look very carefully at the particular situation. How is the data being collected? How is it being used? What are the appropriate metrics in different contexts? And so I think that is both why interdisciplinarity and diversity is so important in this space, but also why it's important for folks to try to avoid simple solutions. So it's great that more toolkits are coming out. It's great that folks, are trying to automate bias checks and corrections, but it's really important also to realize that that should just at most be the first layer to a much more in-depth examination and discussion around the actual system itself and the ways in which different sorts of power dynamics and might be affecting the ultimate outcomes. And that's something that we'll never be able to automate, which good news means if you work in AI ethics, hopefully this will be an area of continuing research for you. But I would just encourage folks to avoid the easy and naive solutions.
Absolutely, because sometimes it's the easy solution that's probably created that bias to begin with. And awesome. So thank you so much, Allison. What about you, Daniel?
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. My colleagues at Salesforce they sometimes use the term, a phrase that designed for those who are not in the room. A lot of times we are, thought leaders and our academics have a certain bias in just our community, and it speaks to the point of need for diversity, but always think about who's not sitting at the table when the idea is being conceived, when the algorithm is being created, when the data is being collected, and when the applications are being used. Once you take that perspective, you begin to think about the unintended consequences that could come, and taking that step to thoughtfully think through the solutions. As Alice mentioned, some of these solutions take really careful thought and takes time. But it starts with really thinking about those who are not at the table.
I really like that. That's a really great way of approaching it. And what about you, Vinay?
Yeah, I have sort of this little laundry list of things that I personally think about that I'd like to share. The first is the mandatory whyness question. Before indulging in any machine learning endeavor or a project, it is very interesting, very pertinent in my opinion to answer the whyness question. If this project is the answer, what is the question? And be brutally honest about that. In many of the cases, I find that a lot of these AI ethics projects, to be very frank, are made towards maximizing the volume of dopamine hits we can get off of social media, because now, whether you like it or not, AI ethics is hot. So everyone is on it. And oftentimes you see the emergence of either these thought bubbles or institutions where it's still very well participatory within the you can call it late stage capitalism or any of those fancy terms, but you're actually still part of the harm system, except that now you're trying to masquerade as being some kind of a bias corrector. Which brings me to the second question, that bias is a red herring. To me, the only thing that matters is harm. It's an overloaded term, which is why you end up with projects like reduction of bias in face attractiveness classification. So you have, the problem is that of face attractiveness classification. So you have 5 different categories, whether this person is absolutely hot, score of 5 or not. And then you come up with some fancy algorithm, basically shopping for theorems within the realm of either information theory or linear algebra. And then you allow it to masquerade as scholarship. And then you say, oh, look, I have written this fancy paper. I'm going to peddle it as a bias reducing thing. And you will basically get a bunch of likes and retweets on social media. And that allows you to build these castles of delusion, if you will. So the very institution of bias, to me, it has a very red herring flavor to it. Harm to me is more easily quantitatively establishable. And that is something that I would rather focus my energy on. And last principle that I personally follow is nothing about us without us. So it's very easy for us to underestimate the trauma of our own work and basically write about the incarcerated people, or these days everyone is woke and we all know big words like global south and all those fancy terms. So you say that, oh, I'm trying to use some cliches, like I'm trying to center the voices of the Black and the minoritized and all of these flowery cliches. But what you're actually trying to do is elevate yourself on the basis that you have you're not paying heed to the unintentional trauma that you might cause. And this has happened to me personally as well. Like, there are a lot of projects that I think from my value framework ought to be worked on. But if I do not find a person with whom I can collaborate from the community that will be heard the most, I basically don't do it. Because if you are going to be that arrogant, then this clearly implies that you have jumped onto the bandwagon because now AI ethics is hot and you're trying to milk a career for yourself, or you're trying to get the next tenure, or basically go from L5 to L6 within the Google pantheon of compensations. So I personally kind of hold myself responsible to these 3 diktats, and I think it's kind of served me well. And that's something that I'd like to share.
Really great. That's a really great laundry list to keep in mind. And I will hand it off to Marissa if she wants to give any final words.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so very much to these amazing panelists and for sharing your time and energy with us and your expertise. I'll have the recording available. I did throw in, I'm going to go ahead and put it in here because I know not all of you attended based on our email list. So feel free to reach out to me. We'll download the recording and we'll upload it to our YouTube channel. And, I'd love to keep these conversations going in the future. If there's ever an opportunity for us all to collaborate or share or share resources, please don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you to the team who coordinated this discussion as well. And thank you to our attendees. Have a lovely day.
Thank you
everyone.
So much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.